In 1973, James McBratney was drinking alone at Snoop's Bar and Grill on Staten Island. It was like any ordinary day, where not a lot of people were present at the bar. As he was ordering a drink, 3 men came in. They were walking briskly towards his back and immediately surrounded him. McBratney found himself handcuffed and a gun was pointed at him. He was outnumbered and unfortunately had left his machine gun in his Cadillac. The 3 men started pulling McBratney away from the bar and were told, "You're under arrest. You've been this route before. Don't give us any trouble." After a patron attempted to intervene, one of the men fired 2 shots into the ceiling of the restaurant and ordered the other patrons and employees, including a young 16-year-old dishwasher, to stand against the wall. One of the waitresses managed to slip away from being caught and called the police from a payphone. Although people would get easily intimidated by the sight of a gun, McBratney was not like any other person. He continued to struggle to break free from the men, where he managed to drag the 3 of them at the end of the bar. One of the men walked towards McBratney, whilst the other 2 held his arms from both sides. He pointed the gun in his head and fired 3 times at the close range. The 3 men immediately fled from the scene, and soon after, the police showed up. Eyewitnesses managed to identify 2 of the 3 men but failed to identify the 3rd man, who was responsible for the shooting of McBratney. They were Gotti, Ruggiero, and Ralph Gallioni, assigned as a hit team to murder McBratney for the kidnapping and murder of the Gambino boss's nephew. The less than discreet operation would eventually become Gotti's signature as the crime boss of the Gambino family, the largest mafia family in New York City. Before I continue with the story, if you are interested in learning more about John Gotti's background, his early life, and even an overview of the 5 mafia families in New York, then I highly recommend that you also download today's podcast episode because there's a lot of stuff that I left out only for the podcast listeners. I don't usually release podcast episodes. I usually focus on making the video on YouTube, but if I were to release a podcast episode, it'd be about a week earlier than the video's release. So be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. The link to the podcast is in the description box below. John Gotti was working under Carmine Fatico when he received his first task, who was one of the capos in the Gambino family, which means he's the captain of a number of mafia soldiers. The task given to him was to hijack the truck at John F. Kennedy's International Airport. He wasn't alone in doing the task, as he was accompanied by his brother Jeannie and friend Ruggiero. Although this is when Gotti received his first major sentence where all of them were convicted of hijacking and sentenced to 3 years in prison. This is also when Gotti met his mentor and Gambino underboss Agnello Nel Della Croce, who will play a huge part in Gotti's career. Della Croce regaled Gotti with tales of past mafia glories under Anastasia, leading Gotti to adopt Anastasia as his role model. While Gotti served his time in prison, the Fatico crew moved from East New York to a storefront near Gotti's home in Queens. The group's headquarters was disguised as a non-profit organization called the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. After his release from prison in 1971, Gotti was designated as the temporary leader of Fatico's gang while the captain faced loan sharking charges. In his new role, Gotti frequently traveled to Della Croce's headquarters at the Revenite Social Club to brief the underboss of the crew's activities. This is when the 2 became even closer together, probably because they have similar traits where both of them have strong violent streaks, cursed a lot, and were heavy gamblers. In 1973, Gotti was assigned as one of the hit teams alongside Ruggiero and Ralph Gallioni to hunt down James McBratney, who was the main suspect for the kidnapping and murder of the Gambino's boss's nephew. As you already know, Gotti and Ruggiero were detained for the killing in June 1974. However, with the help of the hired attorney by Gambino's boss, Roy Cohn, they managed to strike a plea bargain that they would only receive a 4-year sentence for attempted manslaughter for his part in the hit. In 1976, the head of the Gambino family, Carlo Gambino, passed away and chose his brother-in-law, Paul Castellano, in charge of the family. In a gesture of goodwill, Castellano allowed De La Croce to remain the family's underboss, giving him control over 10 of the 23 Gambino crews. When Gotti returned from prison in 1977 for the killing of McBratney, De La Croce promoted the mobster to the captain of the Virgin crew. By the early 1980s, Gotti's prominence in the Gambino family had earned unwanted attention from mob boss Castellano. He considered Gotti's $30,000 a night gambling habit a liability, and he also disapproved of the Virgin captain's unpredictable behavior. Gotti's activities also caught the eye of federal agents who, unbeknownst to the mobster and his crew, installed surveillance equipment in the Virgin Club. In 1985, the FBI had gathered enough evidence to place Gotti and De La Croce under federal indictment for racketeering and other associates indicted on heroin trafficking charges. The drug charges infuriated Castellano, who punished illegal drug trafficking with the penalty of death. The reason that he disapproved of drug trafficking so much is because of the harsh legal penalties it comes with. It might tempt accused perpetrators into betraying their superiors, and this is what exactly happened. As captain, Gotti knew he would be held responsible for the transgressions of his crew, and he needed to smooth over the situation. Gotti asked De La Croce to speak to the boss on his behalf, but before an understanding could be reached, De La Croce died of cancer. Gotti was ready to make things right again with Castellano, but because Castellano didn't attend the funeral of his dear friend, all goodwill between Castellano and Gotti immediately dissolved. Gotti saw the behavior as disrespectful and, according to later testimony, he decided to take action. 2 weeks later, on December 16, 1985, when Castellano and his newly appointed underboss, Thomas Bilotti, were gunned down in the street by a team of assassins in front of Sparks Steakhouse. Gravano, who was Gotti's new underboss, testified in court that he and Gotti watched the shooting of Castellano from a parked car, saying Gotti had arranged the killing. By August 1986, Gotti had become something of a local hero and icon in his Howard Beach neighborhood. When it came time to face trial for the racketeering charges, Gotti and the other defendants were acquitted of their crimes. FBI officials later discovered that the jury foreman fixed the verdict. It was a crushing defeat for law enforcement officials, and Gotti became the mob symbol for invincibility, earning the name Teflon Don because charges against him just wouldn't stick. The FBI then turned the conviction of Gotti into an organizational crusade. After pressuring the Gambino family's new underboss, Sammy Gravano, into testifying against Gotti, the mob leader was finally convicted of murder on April 2, 1992. Gotti remained in jail until June 10, 2002, when he died in the federal prison hospital from complications with head and neck cancer.